Hi, welcome to the Education Policy Equation. I'm your host, Jack Murdoch. My guest today is Dr. Audrey Beardsley, professor at the Mary Lou Fulton Teacher College at Arizona State University. Dr. Beardsley is a hugely renowned figure in the field of education policy research. She's written a number of books, as well as innumerable scholarly articles in education policy. Our topic today is on value added models in education and teacher evaluation. Dr. Beardsley, thank you so much for being on the program.
Oh, thank you for having me.
So, I guess I'd like to begin with a sort of philosophical question, and it may or may not have a simple answer, but I think it's one that's important to the foundation of the conversation we're about to have, and that is, what effect should a good teacher have on their students?
So, a good teacher should, well, first and foremost, probably influence their learning, right? Regardless of grade level, that counts from kindergarten all the way through undergraduate and graduate degrees. And so, the number one thing we want to see from teachers is that they promote student learning. Um, they also should promote critical thinking, overall characteristics in students that support their overall well being, their happiness, the extent to which they are good citizens, the extent to which they care about others, and so forth. But typically, student learning is the number one factor that we want to analyze to make sure that a teacher is, in fact, doing his or her job or their jobs.
That makes a lot of sense to me. I think that's uh, what a lot of people think of when they think, what do I want out of an amazing teacher, really? And what you've just described is nothing short of an amazing teacher, someone who can do that. Um, Now we'll move into value added models. And for those who don't know what value added models are, it's sort of an attempt to measure teacher quality. It's an attempt to measure the impact a teacher has on students' learning using standardized tests. So typically, students will be giving tests before and after taking a class with a teacher, and then there are typically statistical controls for demographic variables that attempt to control for student variation. Um, I guess we'll get to your own evaluation of how good value added models are in a bit. But first, I think it'd be interesting if you could talk about the history of value added models in American education, as well as what the arguments given in defense of value added models are, because it's really pretty popular these days.
Sure. So essentially in across the country and in some nations, but we'll focus on the United States for this interview because the United States is probably the number one country in terms of the extent to which we, as especially a federal government, but also state governments, have relied on tests or standardized tests and test-based educational policies to measure what we just discussed, the extent to which teachers impact student learning. And how we measure that is by using standardized tests to assess student achievement as based on that learning. And so there's a connection there in terms of student learning and student achievement, but with that connection come a lot of assumptions like, do tests actually map onto what is taught? And typically the answer is it's questionable. Also, given that the tests that are usually used, particularly historically, but also in value added models, are typically tests that include about 40 items that are supposed to represent all which is taught throughout a whole student's, for example, a fifth grade mathematics year of teaching under a teacher. So right there you can see some methodological issues. We call them with representation or representativeness, in terms of that which is taught and that which is tested, and how those tests might adequately map onto what teachers do and how effective they are at doing that. But historically, so the country, again, the United States has been really fixated on tests ever since A Nation at Risk was written. That was back in 1987. And that's essentially when the United States, particularly policymakers and politicians, said, our students, we are a global superior nation, and our students are performing average, and that is not acceptable. And that is putting our nation at risk, especially economically. And so, one of the solutions written into that report, or the main solution actually, was to increase the standards that we use to inform what we teach our students across K-12, and then to increase the quality of the tests to to assess the extent to which those higher standards are being taught. And so that's when everything really kind of went a little bit haywire in terms of going states going all in on test-based educational policies. So to back up a little bit, the state of Florida was the first state to actually start toying with the ideas of test based accountability. And accountability, I mean by using tests to assess learning, but also using consequences to make sure that the tests are taken seriously. And those consequences can be positive consequences, like teachers might get merit pay for proving themselves as more effective teachers. That would be a positive. And a negative might be a student doesn't graduate from high school if the student doesn't graduate a high school graduation exam. So Florida was already toying with this idea. Then A Nation at Risk was published. And then that's when the federal government said all states need to start doing what Florida is doing. They didn't directly reference Florida, but it's the same theory of change and the same like carrot and stick principle. And so states, and we have evidence of this ever since 1987, states started adopting high stakes testing policies. And so they did what Nation at Risk wanted them to do: increase the standards, improve the tests, use the tests to assess to what extent the standards were being met, and then add consequences to those tests to make sure that students were taking their learning seriously, teachers were taking their teaching seriously, school administrators were taking their leadership seriously, so on and so forth. So right there you have an assumption that these students weren't doing this in the first place, teachers weren't doing this in this, right? So there's assumptions built into this theory of change for sure. Nonetheless, it continued to move forward, and then George W. Bush, so he was former governor of Texas, and then of course he became our president in 2000. One of his main platforms was an educational platform, and it was based on the same theory of change. We need the nation to adopt higher standards and better tests. So we're 13, 14, 15 years after A Nation at Risk. Same theory of change, but now this is going to be more or less national policy. So he and the Senate, and of course everyone in the legislation passed No Child Left Behind, and that was passed in 2002. And that's really when we went all in. And so states across the country started adopting high school graduation exams. So basically preventing students from graduating if they couldn't pass high school tests and so forth. And so it's just this upward incline and actually an exponential rise in the extent to which tests were now being treated as the key to educational reform, still as based on our fear that our nation was at risk. And the primary way to solve this was to educate our students in a more efficient but also effective and accountability based ways. At that time in the policy, there was something called adequate yearly progress. And so the feds were requiring states to evidence that students were meeting adequate yearly targets. And it was called adequate yearly progress, and it was called AYP. But soon after AYP was implemented, a lot of states had methodological issues with doing this in terms of measuring where students were, how they were growing at the time on these AYP measures. And so enter a set of econometricians who had been using something called value added modeling, in this case, particularly in the state of Tennessee, for agricultural purposes. And so it's basically an inputs and outputs model. And there in the agricultural field, they were using it to measure the extent to which the quality of feed, that was fed to cattle would have an outcome of a better product in terms of beef. And so a one econometrician at the University of Tennessee actually said, why don't we transform this model, this value added model, to education? So while this is all happening at the federal level, he's advocating for using value added models to assess the extent to which teachers grow their students literally, and using as the input variable a pretest and the output variable a post test. And the assumption there is what happens from the pre to the post, whatever growth or value added is observed, that can be causally attributed to the teacher. There are a lot of assumptions. I call them heroic assumptions that are built into that statement there, but that's the theory of change that still has rolled over from a nation at risk, that we still need to reform schools, still need to rely on tests, but now we have a better measure to do this, where we can hold teachers more accountable for what they're doing in terms of their effectiveness. So his model, his value added model, was purchased by a big statistical company, and they basically they lobbied the federal government to move from the No Child Left Behind legislation to something that's called Race to the Top. So Race to the Top was, you might have to correct me on this, 4.35 billion in terms of federal funds that were given to states under the condition. There were a lot of conditions, but in terms of what we're talking about today, the main condition was that states had to adopt value added models, which are sometimes called growth models. And there is a statistical differentiation there, but we can save that for another day. But the more sophisticated of the two are the value added models. So states were incentivized, if they wanted to get federal funds, and they rely heavily on federal funds. So they were kind of forced besides incentivized. But if they wanted to keep their federal funds, they had to apply for Race to the Top grants. The first state to win a grant was, perhaps not surprisingly, the state of Tennessee, because they had been doing this for a long time, right? And they were also part of the original, the organization that was helping to lobby the federal government at the time. So states by states, they started adapting and implementing value added models. And then again, we have the carrot and stick component of the theory of change, but now it's all teacher centered. And so now teachers are either to show that they're high value added teachers, or they can be terminated. They can be put into professional development, which might be a good thing anyways, but still a high stakes consequence. They can be denied bonuses. They can also, on the positive side, they can be given merit pay if they prove themselves as highly value added, and so forth. So after this happened, a lot of states and districts, following the federal leads, they started making a lot of erroneous and legally indefensible decisions as based on test scores, because while the theory of change held, the research did not support the theory of change. And so, for example, 221 teachers in the Houston Independent School District who were using this actual model about which I'm speaking, they were terminated by the superintendent in 1 year. So they, of course, many of them filed lawsuits against the district because the value added model did not have the empirical merit to justify those types of decisions, especially in isolation of other data that mapped onto other indicators of their effectiveness that countered the value added data, in a nutshell.
Absolutely. So you mentioned in response to my first question, you gave an account of what how a teacher should affect a student. And there were a lot of things in there like happiness and citizenship that a teacher should promote in students that are obviously pretty hard to measure. But you said that an impact on learning is probably the most important aspect of a teacher. Tell us why you're skeptical of value added models' ability to accurately assess a teacher's impact on student learning.
Okay, so the first thing would be because using the value added model, you have to use the tests as basic proxies to measure that student learning. So the number one question is when we're trying to assess that impact, is the large scale standardized test the best tool to do that? And the answer is clearly no. Other tests, there's a professor whose name, he's an emeritus professor, so he's retired. His name is James Popham. He's retired from UCLA, University of California, Los Angeles. And his statement that I always quote is that the farther the test gets away from the classroom, the worse the test gets. And so when we're talking about these federal and state policies, we're almost always talking about state level standardized tests. And those are the tests I referred to earlier, that they typically include about 40 items that are supposed to represent a year's learning in whatever subject area, which is typically mathematics and English language arts per year, right? And so, one big problem with those tests is that the tests are norm referenced typically to discriminate between students who know things and students who don't. And so, for every item that might have been taught really well and the students they answer often, they answer correctly often, there's also another item on the test that's barely been taught because it might not matter as much in the grand scheme of things. It might not be something that might be real world applied or even practical in terms of the real world. So it's not addressed in the typical teacher's classroom, but because it helps discriminate the scores around a bell curve, it's included on the test. So, one question we all have to ask ourselves is when you're assessing the impact of a teacher, does it matter as much? Which matters more? Which side of that normal curve? The questions that students are all answering most often correctly are typically the things that we all would agree that students need to know. The other side of this curve are things like the box and whisker plot, which is a statistical tool that as a statistician, I honestly rarely use, versus a pie chart or a circle graph or a column graph or a line graph. Those things we know, these things we read in the paper, like we know the real world applicability. But here we've got the box and whisker plot, which is on almost every test. Why? Because it discriminates. It helps the test constructors discriminate between those who know these certain things, but also there's only a few who know what the box and whisker plot is and how to interpret that. So when we say that we're looking at how we're measuring teacher impact, the measuring of the teacher impact isn't representative of what teachers are, as per the standards, really supposed to teach students to know what they need to know and what they're able to do. So we start with that as an issue. But then what we do is we compound it. So at the beginning of this interview, you said that, you'd look at, let's keep with the fifth grade teacher, and the students enter the classroom and there's a pretest. And this, you didn't say this, but I'm kind of extrapolating or a little bit interpolating. There's a pre-test and then there's a post-test. Well, what we don't often know is that that pre-test happened the year prior in like March or April when those students were with the fourth grade teacher, right? And so those are called residual effects. So the assumption is a classical experimental design. I'm the teacher, the pre-test happens here, the post-test happens here, and everything that changes in between this is my responsibility. That's my impact. Those are my effects. But that's ideal. That's only in an ideal world, and that doesn't happen in reality. So, what happens is these tests are given, which are still problematic tests for many more reasons than I just gave one example. But they're given with a fourth grade teacher, let's say April, the year prior. The students have 2 months to finish out the year, and then they go into summers, right? And in summertime, there's a lot of differential effects, and they're typically based on resources. So some students are going to camps that have a lot of learning activities and so forth, and students who are typically less wealthy with less resources are maybe not even reading over the summers, right? So there's a lot of what's called summer growth and summer decay, and they're high. whatever happens there is highly correlated with resources, familial resources. Nonetheless, my students enter my classroom, then I do teach them up until, let's just say, April, and then I'm given credit or I'm critiqued for the value added or value detracted that I had in that time. So we have these tests that I should also mention have only ever been validated to assess student learning and achievement. They've never been evaluated to assess teacher impacts on student learning and achievement. And when we get to validity theory, that's a violation right away. You have to have the test validated for the purposes and the uses for which they're being implemented. Nonetheless, then we look at the results and we look at this theory of change. Like, this is what are we actually assessing using value added models a teacher's impact on his or her students over time, the growth and change, and growth and change over time. So the first thing that we look at, and this is as per the standards of educational and psychological testing, which is basically like the nation's, but all it's international Bible in terms of the way that we assess tests. The first criteria is reliability. And so reliability, synonymous with reliability, is consistency. And so, if these value added models were to work, we would see consistent ratings from year to year. So, I'm that fifth grade teacher, and I am an amazing teacher. We would expect to see high value added, high value added, high value added. Research suggests you have to have 3 consistent scores right now for you actually to be classified as high value added. A lot of states have made a lot of silly decisions based on 1 year alone, so that's a violation of research in and of itself. So that's the ideal world if this was to work as it's supposed to, as theorized. And it rarely, maybe 10%, 15% of the time, does it work out that way. What happens much more often is a lack of reliability, which is a lack of consistency, where you'll see a teacher like me who is really effective, let's just say, but my scores will go from high value added to ineffective to average. So all over the place. And then my colleague, who we all know is not an effective teacher, will come in at low value added. And yeah, that makes sense to us. That's got face validity to us. And then the next year, he'll have high value added, high value added. And so, but then the principals also who are doing observations of both of us at this time are saying, yeah, for me, you are an excellent teacher. How could you have gotten a low value added score? We observe you every year. You do the same thing every year. You have the same types of students every year. What in the heck is going on? Where the principals might be saying, this teacher is not good. Like, we all know that this teacher is not good and probably should be terminated. But now, based on the value added reports, he's doing stellar. So that right there is the first major methodological issue when we look at the standards, because you have to have consistency over 3 years before you can make any type of consequential decision whatsoever. Otherwise, what it's telling us is there's so much error already, and it's coming from the tests. One time use, there's error, but then when you put the tests together, there's more error. And then you put the tests and try to measure growth over time, you're increasing the error exponentially. And that's why we're seeing such fluctuations. So, as per the standards, if we don't have reliability, we're supposed to throw the instrument out. Nonetheless, we have invested politically and policy wise in these models, and we're incentivizing states. So, let's just move past reliability and let's take a look at validity. And so then we have to question, are these tests validated for assessing teacher quality? The answer is no. And that's something that's called content related evidence of validity. If we talk to people about, do you feel like this is a good test of your impact on students learning over time? Probably 9 times out of 10 teachers would say no, because then they'd probably have even more reasons than I, of which I'm even aware, because I only know the research empirical side. The pragmatic side is where their voices would probably matter on this point. Nonetheless, we continue to move forward and we look at criterion validity. So we're looking at other indicators, which I alluded to before. If there's a high value added teacher, are there other measures that are saying, indeed, she is high value added, high value added? So we have other markers. The observers agree, my students agree via surveys, my students' parents agree. So I'm building this like system, a holistic system where my supervisors can say she's checking all these marks. This teacher is stellar. But what's problematic about that, especially with the value added component, is we don't have that. If anything, the value added indicator is contradicting not only the principles, observations. Oftentimes, some of these teachers have been awarded Teachers of the Year at the local level, the district level, or sometimes the state level. Oftentimes, they're no, not oftentimes, sometimes they're national board certified teachers. So they've already been validated as excellent teachers, like national board certified doctors in a very similar process. In fact, one of the lawsuits in New York, there was a national board certified teacher who was on the chopping block for termination, and the reason she was there, she was an effective teacher. She was nationally board certified. Her principals all testified on her behalf. But the problem was that she taught gifted students. And for her gifted students who were already so highly achieving, their predicted value, her predicted value added was off the scale that the test, it was above the scale that the test even went. So let's just say that the test had a maximum of 400 points. Her students were expected to grow 550, but they couldn't. So what happened was a regression effect and came back, and it counted her as a highly ineffective teacher, which is another error statistical test-based problem. So those types of things are really have really been at the core of these lawsuits as well, in that there's so much contradictory data. Also, on the flip side, where there's high value added teachers and the principals are like, if we can only terminate this teacher, but now we've got these data that everybody think because they're so objective, they're true, and they're not necessarily true. And then there's more on top of that, including bias, the types of teachers, I'm sorry, the type of students that teachers teach. If they're really typically low performing students, the question is, can teachers who sometimes choose to work in those environments, can they grow their students enough and so forth? So it's highly problematic, highly complicated, and not nearly as clean cut as the theory behind using value added models for these purposes and definitions suggests.
Yeah, so listening to that, it seems like there are a number of problems. It seems like one of the main problems is that the test is very inadequate as a measure of learning, and it's also very inconsistent. Even if we were to assume it was a good measure of student learning, it seems like it's um, very inconsistent among teachers, and that scores vary so much from year to year. Um, what are your intuitions on what an appropriate teacher evaluation system would look like? You mentioned student surveys. What would a holistic teacher evaluation look like? And would test scores have any role in it whatsoever, or would you rely more on in-person assessments?
Yeah. So even because I have talked to teachers over the years in terms of my research, but also in like depositions for these lawsuits. And the other assumption is that teachers use the data from these large scale standardized tests to improve their practice. But in reality, they're like, we've got 40 items here to work with. And they're not, those tests aren't really telling us what we can do better in terms of our practice. Most teachers want to be better at their jobs, right? I'd like to believe that most anybody wants to be better at their jobs, regardless of what they do, and teachers are no different. A handful of them, yeah, maybe the outliers, but for the general, for the general teacher, they want to improve upon their practice, but they do often report that they cannot use these large standardized tests to inform their practice, which makes sense. Back to the comment I made or the quote of James Popham: "The farther the test gets away from the classroom, the worse it gets." So district assessments are something that probably offer more value in terms of this, in terms of allowing teachers to be able to, allowing administrators to be able to assess teachers for their impacts on student learning, but also to allow teachers to use the data derived to inform their practice. And so those two things are called summative purposes and formative purposes. The latter is basically information informing practice, that's formative. The summative is to make decisions about, like, indeed, is this a high quality teacher or an average teacher or whatever they might be. That's more of a summary statement. So to do that, this test would probably be involved. I would advise states to not rely too heavily on the state level test, but to rely more heavily probably on the district level tests, if not the school or classroom based tests. I used to be a teacher. My test always informed my self developed test, or the tests like available in the materials that we have for teaching, always told me more about my teaching, because I could look, I said, this is what I thought I taught well. And then I look at the test results. I'm like, whoa, I clearly didn't teach this whole content area well. I need to go back and revisit that to make sure my students learn that. That's real. It's tangible. It's hands on. It's timely, because I could turn that right around within the next couple days, and I could say, sorry, students, let's try this again. With these large scale tests, the teachers don't even get the results until the next year when their students are gone. Like, they're just not formatively functionable. So, district level, somewhere around medium, district level, classroom level tests, definitely I would include those as part of a more holistic evaluation system. The American Educational Research Association suggests that we use multiple measure systems. And so that is a more holistic system. So they would probably agree with me, or I agree with them, to have some kind of test based system, but you can also have the observational system for sure. Those are also problematic because sometimes there can be bias in those, in terms of principals who might favor certain teachers over other teachers. There are a lot of issues with, teacher or observers of certain genders being biased against teachers of opposite genders, races. There are definitely biases in there that distort and thwart the efficacy of those as instrument. There's no perfect instrument, is the point. So the value added is not perfect. The observational systems are not perfect as well. But there are ways that we can improve the observational systems in terms of having other people conduct observations at the same time, for example. So you increase inter-rater reliability and you decrease the bias potentially. But we have to check that empirically. The student surveys, that's the kind of the new measure on the block. A lot of districts and states are using these now, but unfortunately they're not using them well, because they're not survey researchers themselves. And so things like response rates, they might have a 20% response rate if they're using a parent survey, let's just say, and you can't make any valid decisions based on 20% response rate, because there's obvious bias that's inserted into that equation. So if we could get the districts and the schools and the states on board with using appropriate survey research methods and conditions, as long as these conditions are met, then you've got a solid indicator. But that includes response rates, because without a high response rate, without a validated instrument, you cannot make many decisions, because the bias is so, it thwarts the inferences and the decisions to be made. And so systems based on multiple measures is the short answer to that, although that's also really complicated. And also, one last note, the people who evaluates the teacher is also a really important question. So, is it the principal that has all the power, or do we make these systems more democratic, where other teachers might evaluate? They might have peer observations, for example, or they might evaluate their peers' total dossiers or portfolios, and knowing the context in which they teach, they might be better suited and more. It's also holistic, because there's more people looking at the same files at the same time. That would increase the reliability and also theoretically the validity of those decisions, in terms of categorizing teachers as highly effective or not.
Absolutely. And then one last question for you, and this is kind of another broad question, but what do you imagine, or what do you see the future of value added models in American education looking like? Are we going to continue to use these as to make high stakes decisions? Is it going to become more prominent, or do you see a move away from them towards the more holistic measures you described?
So I okay. So after Race to the Top was passed, which was around 2009, 2011. I forget. There was like a first iteration of it. Then I believe because of so many lawsuits popped up because of the consequential nature, not the consequential nature, the consequential uses and often abuses of the value added output um, in terms of consequences. I think there were so many of those that the feds and maybe with the advice of state leaders said we can't use these in consequential ways because all the lawsuits in which I was involved except for one, which was a rational basis test lawsuit, which was kind of a different kind of type of lawsuit in and of itself, we won. And so wrongful termination suits, any kind of consequence, we pretty much won them all. And because the empirical research did not support the use of them in those certain states and districts. And then the biggest lawsuit was in Houston, and the lawyer there found that it was using the value added model there was a violation of teachers' 14th Amendment rights because they, as a proprietary system, they didn't have access to their data, nor did they have access to the equation that was being used to classify them and also terminate them, nor did they have the mathematical ability to be able to say, "Hey, that doesn't make sense," or "That's not right." So it was a really big win in that lawsuit, and I think that also I'd like to think that that informed the change when the Every Student Succeed Act was passed, and in that that was 2016. In that the federal government finally said, "You know what? We've had a little bit too much control over the states. We're going to hand the control back to states a bit more. We still encourage states to use these growth and value added models, but it's no longer an incentivized requirement." And so after that, I did do a study with some doctoral students, and we saw that there was a significant decline in terms of the extent to which states were using the models, especially for consequential purposes. However, in some states, we had interviews and so forth, they had already invested so many resources and also human resources into this because of Race to the Top. It was hard for them to let go. So those states are still using value added models, but no, not for really any significant consequential purposes at this point. I just got done with this lawsuit in Florida who's still pretty strong on this. It was another wrongful teacher termination suit that we also won there. So I know there's pockets of places that are still doing kind of crazy things with the value added output that are not legally or empirically warranted. But overall, I think there has been a decline. Will they ever go away? I don't think so because our nation has been bent on test based policies ever since 1987, and in Florida since 1979. And for the last, let's see, we're at almost over 40 years of educational policy that's bent on test based educational reform. I think that we're going to still see reiterations of the same theory of change over and over again. And we haven't had results in the past on this. It's more of like Einstein's definition of insanity. Insanity, you just keep on applying the same theory of change and hoping that the next time it's applied, you're going to actually see the results that you want. But we have 40 plus years of no evidence really whatsoever that this has improved. We're still at the average in terms of international test scores that we were concerned about when we were at risk in 1987. So,
Well, that's a sobering note, but I can only hope that we can turn more, and you can only hope, I suppose.
right,
Um,
yeah. You got to have a positive side, otherwise, it's very, very depressing.
Absolutely, Dr. Beardsley, I'd like to thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thank you so much.